This is John Nichols of The Nation magazine, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. This is episode 580. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman, who's been here since the beginning. Hello, David.
Yeah, too much information is a bad thing. I think 580 shows. That's
a lot of information. You know who else is here?
Who?
Our producer, Hannah Feldman. Hello, Hannah.
Hello.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello, everybody. Well, we're going to talk about my new book, Civic Self Respect. Involves all of you.
Yes, we're going to do something a little different on today's program. Our first guest is none other than Ralph Nader. I'm going to interview Ralph about his new book, Civic Self Respect, published by Seven Stories Press. Chris Hedges has said that civic self-respect is a, quote, clarion call for all of us to be engaged citizens, to refuse to be passive bystanders, and to take seriously our responsibilities in a democratic society. In the book, Ralph reminds us that our civic lives have different primary roles, not only voter, but also worker, taxpayer, consumer, sometimes soldier, and sometimes parent, and how each one offers special opportunities for people to organize to make change. And we'll let you know how to get your copy of Civic Self-Respect at the end of the interview. In the second half of the show, we're going to welcome back former IRS Commissioner John Koskinen. The IRS is not exactly the American public's most popular government agency, but it is the key to keeping the government running. And it contains private information that Elon Musk and his Doge bros are trying to get at in order to weaponize the agency. Mr. Koskinen just co-authored an op-ed in the New York Times titled, "Trump Just Fired 6,700 IRS Workers in the Middle of Tax Season." That's a huge mistake. But we're going to find out how gutting the IRS is just a tax cut for tax cheats. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our tireless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But to kick things off, David, please introduce our first guest.
Is it pronounced Ralph? It's pronounced Ralph, right? Ralph Nader is the author of Civic Self Respect. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Ralph Nader.
Welcome. It happens to be probably the most fundamental book I've ever written, and can apply to all of us in our country, all of us.
Well, Ralph, we're going to talk to you about that. And the first question I want to ask you is about the title. Why self-respect? I understand the civic part, but what are you getting at with self-respect?
What I'm getting at is that too many people have a low estimate of their own significance in terms of their role in a productive and just democracy. They count themselves out. They give up on themselves. They use words like, "I'm a nobody, but I have a question." Some of my meetings around the country. And civic self-respect means that everybody develops an attitude where they can continue their regular daily life as workers and consumers and parents, but add a civic dimension in order to improve the neighborhood, the community, the state, the country, the world, depending on their interest and temperament. And that's why the book has no subtitle. It's just civic self-respect. What am I, as a person in this country, going to do about injustices as I perceive them? How I'm going to contribute to more opportunity for everybody, to foresee and forestall terrible omnicides coming our way, climate, bacterial, viral epidemics, nuclear war, ravages of poverty, and so on.
So you wrote a book a few years ago called Breaking Through Power. How is this different than Breaking Through Power?
Well, Breaking Through Power basically tries to give people a sense of self-empowerment, because we all grow up sort of powerless in our elementary, secondary school education. You know, it's very much computer training, memorization, regurgitation, vegetation, learning myths, instead of learning civic skills, engaging in the community that you're a part of with your parents or with adults who are already active. And so Breaking Through Power basically tries to deflate the notion that trying to get the few powerful rulers, sort of the corporate rulers, government rulers together in a corporate state accountable. And to get rid of this saying, you can't fight City Hall. And to give people examples throughout history where very few people representing broad public opinion overpowered the concentrated forces in places like Congress.
So I want to get to those places, but first I want to ask you, in your preface, you talk about the stages of activity. So I assume you're not expecting someone who's never done anything like this before to just become the next Ralph Nader. You say it goes in stages. Tell us about that.
Well, the stages are an attempt to get the reader of this book feeling that they don't have to disrupt their regular life. They can start, for example, as consumers and workers, of looking out for ways they can be better consumers and workers in terms of their rights, and getting their own circle of consumers and workers thinking the same way. So if, for example, you're shopping for food and you've been learning how to shop for nutritious food, not food full of fat, sugar, and other bad things, salt, etc., that you start talking it up. Everybody has some credibility with somebody. They don't have to be influencers at that level. So that's one stage. The second stage is you get so interested in this, you start reading up on it and seeing what groups, like the Center for Science Public Interest and Nutrition Action newsletter, are trying to get a wave of respecting the importance of food and one's health. So you reach that level and say you subscribe to Nutrition Action and you become part of that in a very small but effective way. And then the third is when you really get interested and you start taking leadership roles and you devote a few more hours every week to some injustice or some solution to a problem that you feel good about.
What seems to be important, just as a regular person myself, is the feeling that, oh, am I going to have to invent the wheel? It seems to me that connecting with groups that are doing the things that you're interested in seems to be a really important step, would you say?
Yeah, it's a very important step. This is not a how-to book. I mean, I've written, and a lot of other people have written, how to be a better consumer in 400 pages, or how to lobby state legislatures, or how to put on a press conference. This is not a how-to. It starts at a much more elementary level, and therefore should interest a much greater number of people. Because, as I say, if you can expand your civic dimension as a part of your daily role without disrupting the rhythms of your daily life, in fact, actually making them more gratifying and more interesting, less boring, you're on your way. That's why the table of contents is like no other book. The table of contents is the chapters. I, the citizen, I, the worker, I, the consumer shopper, I, the taxpayer, I, the voter, I, the parent, I, the veteran, I, the philanthropist. And except for I, the philanthropist, although middle and lower income people give a greater percent of their income to charity than rich people, people have these roles. And this book, in effect, said you can add an exciting, interesting, productive, constructive dimension as you continue engaging these roles.
And it seems to me that what you're saying here is one of the keys is starting small. Don't get too ambitious. Get something that interests you. Maybe find a group that works in that area and educate yourself and take it from there. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yeah, very fair assessment, because too many people go through life thinking it's useless to try to change anything. And if you start small, you're more likely to achieve your goals as you escalate your goals from making things better and getting motivated.
Well, let me ask you this then. In your own life and career, what was the small thing that launched you on your civic life?
Losing some of my friends in deadly car crashes, high school and college. Far more death and injury in those days than today. It was very common. There were no seatbelts, no airbags, no padded dash panels, no collapsing steering columns to avoid a spear and a frontal collision, no rollover protection. The brakes were fairly lousy. handling was not very good on cornering maneuvers, so things are a lot better now. But I really felt deeply as I started reading about the ability of the auto companies to make their motor vehicles more crash-worthy, that these fatalities of my friends, acquaintances, were entirely preventable.
So it sounds like, one of the things to identify in oneself, whatever role it is, whether citizen, worker, veteran, whatever, is to find something that affects you emotionally, that outrages you or makes you angry or irritated.
That's exactly right, Steve. Mothers Against Drunk Drivers is a good example. They lost their children, drunk drivers, and started getting stronger legislation, stronger education, stronger treatments of alcoholism, and more protective motor vehicles.
Yeah, because if you say the word civics, it sounds very intellectual. It sounds like heady. It sounds like it's about rules. It's about regulations. But finding the thing that motivates you emotionally is, I guess, an important impetus to get you off the couch and doing something.
Usually, we call them victims groups. People who've lost loved ones to a dangerous product, like, the 737 MAX Boeing, mobilizing themselves and getting legislation through Congress, trying to hold Boeing accountable, and stronger regulation from the FAA, more disclosure, more demands by air passengers for safer skies. And I've often said there should be a convention of these groups because they're tremendously motivated. You know how you have to keep exhorting people out of their apathy or out of their surrender of self-respect to citizens? Well, you don't have to do that with these groups. And the media is full of local, state, national, international efforts by these groups because they had a personal tragedy, and they wanted to make sure no one else had a repeat of that personal tragedy.
So let's get into the individual chapters. And I'm going to start off with chapter 1, which is I, the Citizen. And you wrote something in here. You talked about ancient Greece, and I'd never heard this. Tell us about public citizens versus idiots in ancient Greece.
Well, in this remarkable city, ancient Athens, there were about 50,000 people. Centuries and centuries ago, they developed a public philosophy of civic engagement. And they highlighted and regaled the Athenians who tried to improve their city. And they labeled the people in Athens who didn't give a hoot about their community or their neighborhood as idiots, people of ignorance. Of course, that has a different connotation today, but it's interesting how we don't have that kind of honoring hierarchy. The people who really fight for justice in this country have to fight for recognition. They have to fight for media. They have to fight for an onslaught. And the people who lie and cheat and say the most terrible things and do the most terrible things are really the best known people in the country. I mean, look at it. If you say, who are the best known people in Congress? They're the blowhards, the cruel and vicious people who've said things that are illegal, outrageous, against innocent groups here and abroad.
The idiots, yeah. We're being run by idiots. Ralph, talk about your father as a role model for civic engagement, especially in terms of fighting apathy and indifference.
Well, he owned a restaurant and delicatessen, and it was a large restaurant and delicatessen and bakery, had a lot of booths, had a lot of space. So people would come, wanted to eat and drink, and they wanted to talk. The factories were right across the street, huge textile mills, for example, across the street from the Mad River that went between the factories and the main street for over a mile. And he came to this country for economic opportunity from Lebanon in 1912, which was a heavy immigration year, by the way. But he also came for freedom. You know, Lebanon at that time was under the Ottoman Empire. There have been worse dictatorships in the Ottoman Empire. They had a lot of autonomy, but, you know, you had to be careful about what you said. So he would say to people in the restaurant, who would say, Mr. Nader, you're so outspoken, you know, you keep going like this, you're going to lose business. People who disagree with you aren't going to come in. He said, well, when I sailed past the Statue of Liberty in 1912, I took it seriously. Don't you? Well, that was part of his education of people about their rights. And so even though he was restricted to staying in the restaurant 7 days a week, he would always talk. He would talk politics. He would talk history. He would talk enjoyable things that made people laugh. Nearby shoe store owner once said, at Nader's restaurant for a nickel, you got a cup of coffee and 10 minutes of political discussion. So over the years, people coming through on Route 44, jurors who came to the restaurant for their lunch break from the nearby county courtroom, they would always find him talking about important things to them.
In this chapter, The Citizen, the Citizen, Ralph, you also talk about, and it's something you've talked about in this program too, the difference between charity and justice. Tell our listeners or remind them what that difference is.
Well, charity is important, especially when you live in a society with less justice. For example, soup kitchens are pretty important for people who are hungry, and there are millions of people, including children, in this country of plenty who are hungry. However, if we had a reasonable living wage, if we had social safety net that occurs in Western Europe, especially health insurance, for example, and maternal care and daycare, family paid leave, sick leave, we'd have more justice and there'd be less need for charity. I mean, if people have jobs that pay a living wage, they're not going to need food kitchens. They're not going to need food stamps. There are a lot of working people who can't make enough money to meet all the necessities of the household, and they're on food stamps. So I always say, and this gets great resonance, by the way, in the audiences I've spoken to. It's very gratifying. In Madison Square Garden in 2000, 20,000 people, I said a society that has more justice is a society that needs less charity. There was a huge immediate roar of recognition.
You talk about in this chapter too, Ralph, some citizens who became civic heroes. Tell us first about, you mentioned a few of them I'm aware of, and actually a couple of them we've had on the show, but who are Ed and Joyce Koopel?
They were a remarkable couple in California. Ed Koopel was a used car salesman, and Joyce Koopel would dabble in various community activities. But then they said, we're not getting anywhere. We got to think bigger. And this was during the Ronald Reagan governorship of California. And so they started reading. You know, I always say, readers think, thinkers read. We don't have enough readers on the progressive liberal side to my taste, I'll tell you. I put out book after book, and I find people in my inner circle who've never read these books, although I try to respect and read the books that they put out. Anyhow, they came across the initiative right in California. In other words, if you get enough petitions signed and the number of signatures, hundreds of thousands, by the way, are required in California, are verified by the Secretary of State, then you can put your own legislation or your own resolution on the ballot for a vote in the coming election. Well, they began perfecting the way to get signatures fast all over California. They would set up tables, shopping centers. They were allowed to do that in California, unlike some other states. And they would have ways to curtail the time it takes to ask people to sign. They'd have very abbreviated, motivated invitations, and they would get volunteers, replicate them. Anyhow, they got enough signatures to put on the ballot the recall of Ronald Reagan. So they thought. But, as often happens, some of the signatures were disqualified for arbitrary reasons, and so there was never a vote on recalling Ronald Reagan. But they learned how to put issues on the ballot for California voters by passing the legislature, called direct democracy, and they got election reform commission approved. They got protection of the beaches and coastlines of California approved, and then they started teaching people in Colorado and other states how to do it when the tragedy of cancer struck Ed Koopel and he passed away. But the People's Lobby is still part of California history, and there's a little book that they put out after Ed passed away that everybody should read about how a husband-wife team with no connections, no money, no way to get their calls returned, were on the verge of becoming a real power. Senators would call them up, get advice or support. They were on their way to spreading all around the country in the 25 or so states that have the initiative referendum procedure of direct democracy awakened and used. And in my book, I talk about a man in Houston, Texas, whose civic hobby, Steve, is to get people to understand that if not at the state level, there are a lot of towns and cities who have the referendum right. It's not used enough by people. You don't have to wait for the city council under the pressure of commercial lobbying to do the right thing. You can qualify it, put it on the ballot, and get the people to vote for it.
Well, that seems like an important point, Ralph, because you said Ed and Joyce Kupel, their goal was to recall Governor Ronald Reagan. They didn't get that, but it seemed like they got a lot of other things along the way that have endured. And that seems like a lesson.
Exactly. Because, people said, hey, these people are like us. We start out powerless. We don't know anybody who knows somebody. And they built it from scratch. Sheer grit. They turned their home into a beehive activity. Maybe too much of a beehive for Joyce's taste. But, they lived a life of joy because they saw themselves as counting for something, meaning something.
That's very good. So let's move to chapter 2, which is called I, the Worker. This is another role. We just did citizen as a worker. Ralph, how can the worker go about fighting the odds, becoming freer to stand up and speak out without jeopardizing their employment?
Well, in a way, there's never been a more important time for that to happen, Steve, because when we were both younger, there was never such a thing as a non-compete clause that tens of millions of workers working for places like McDonald's have to sign, which basically says that if you leave McDonald's or some other fast food or retail chain, you can't go and work for another retail chain, which the Federal Trade Commission was challenging as an anti-competitive illegal practice. When we were younger, Steve and David, there wasn't something known as signing non-disparagement commitments that you wouldn't criticize publicly your company. Now, companies can shut people up inside companies as employees, and they do regularly. They don't like whistleblowers. And it's legal because it's inside the company. No government, by the way, could do that to a government employee. That would be state action violating the federal First Amendment. But outside, let's say you work for a meat processing company, and outside after work, a reporter calls you up and says, what do you think? Give us your candid assessment here. If you say anything critical of your employee, they can sue you. They've gotten you to sign this anti-disparagement law. They could sue you anyway, but they could sue you and make you pay if you sign anti-disparagement law, unless you get a good judge who rules that such a agreement is against public policy and unenforceable.
In this chapter 2 of The Worker, Ralph, you also talk about the importance of whistleblowers in the workplace. Give us a little rundown on that.
Well, it's all part of your first question, Steve, which is nobody can stop workers from not learning what their rights are under federal and state law, fair labor standards, minimum wage, worker safety practices, the duty to be notified of dangerous conditions, for example. And the more you let your employer, in a nice way, know that you know what your rights are, say in a big auto factory or chemical plant or big bank, the more that employer is going to respect you more. They're not going to mess with you because you know what your rights are under OSHA and other health safety standards. There's about $60 billion a year in stolen wages, according to a nonprofit economic policy institute in Washington. Well, part of that is that people allow themselves, especially low-income minority workers, to be coerced. They don't know what their rights are. So that's the first step. The second step is to recognize that they now have whistleblower rights. We had our first whistleblower conference in 1972 in Washington, D.C. I wish it was videotaped. There were a couple hundred whistleblowers, people with real guts who sacrificed their careers by taking their conscience to work and informing the general public of a dangerous or unethical or rip-off practice, it affected them. And these are whistleblowers of corporations, whistleblowers of the Pentagon, other government agencies, some whistleblowers, some corrupt unions, and it was quite a session. Hour after hour, we heard them. And so I drafted the preliminary list of whistleblower rights, what rights ethical whistleblowers have. Up until then, whistleblowers were viewed as snitches. You know, they ratted on their employer. Well, now, more than ever, whistleblowers can blow the whistle. For example, government employee, and they see commercial interests defrauding Medicare, they can blow the whistle. They get the Justice Department to agree to take the case, and they pursue it to verdict or settlement. The whistleblower gets maybe 20% of the coverage. There have been whistleblowers who've gotten millions of dollars under a federal statute. And a nice side effect of that is a lot of states have passed whistleblower laws, and it started spreading throughout the world. Even in authoritarian countries, there are nominal whistleblowing laws, as brought together by the law professor Robert Vaughn in a book that more people should read about the global movement for whistleblower protection. The one thing about whistleblowers is companies can't go to Congress and deregulate. You can't deregulate someone's conscience and moral courage. And a lot of big business CEOs, they dread whistleblower rights because they can't control it by definition. And they're inside the belly of the beast, just like the two whistleblowers on Zuckerberg's Facebook, which he renamed Meta. They're driving Zuckerberg crazy. The two books that they've come out with, two women who blew the whistle on Facebook, and now they are key witnesses in the ongoing Federal Trade Commission investigation to break up Meta, make them sell off Instagram and WhatsApp, and diminish their concentration of economic power in the marketplace. That's the one thing the Trump administration has done that surprised some of us. They continued the Biden administration antitrust investigations into Silicon Valley.
What a lot of people might not know, Ralph, a lot of workers might not know, is that there are resources for workers. And one of them that occurs to me in this chapter, you talk about a gentleman named Paul Tobias and the National Employment Lawyers Association. Who's Paul Tobias and what is the National Employment Lawyers Association?
Well, Paul Tobias was my classmate at Harvard Law School, and unlike most graduates, he got his degree and went into an area that was pretty unorganized, which was unorganized workers. He noticed that the vast majority of workers in this country were not members of unions, especially in these large corporations. And he asked himself, who's representing them? He noted that we have some of the worst anti-union organizing laws in the Western world, like the Taft-Hartley Act, 1947. And so he started this group that you just mentioned of lawyers who taught themselves how to represent non-unionized workers' grievances and injustices. And he started a journal to fertilize more and more ideas. He had annual conferences around the country, and it became sort of a sub-bar association of lawyers who represented non-unionized workers, and that they used all kinds of techniques that hadn't been used before. They used tort law, they used contract law, they used the ability of persuasion. It wasn't all use of coercive legal action, and he's passed away, but he's an unsung hero, and he's given a lot of tools for non-unionized workers in dangerous situations around the country to use. That's why in this book, Civic Self Respect, I want to try to bring these wonderful heroes to higher visibility, not just to respect what they did for society at large, but to have them be motivators. Because they all started with, very little assets to pursue the justice that they saw materialize because of their efforts.
Well, we're going to cut it short here and pick it up again next week, where David and Hannah will take us through the remaining chapters. The book is Civic Self Respect. To get your copy, go to nader.org. For $18, you'll get a signed copy, shipping included in the United States. So that's go to nader.org, $18 to get you your signed copy of Civic Self Respect. Thank you, Ralph. We'll continue this next week.
Well, thank you, Steve, and I want to end with a note of candor here. I've been very disturbed by the liberal progressive media reviewing books like ours, and I'm going to name them: Progressive Magazine, In These Times, Nation Magazine, Washington Monthly, and other internet bloggers. Now, on the right-wing side, they have these talk radio show hosts that are full of vitriol and empty of evidence. And they put out these books attacking the so-called left, and they become almost immediate bestsellers. So there's something missing in the readership level of our side, so to speak. And I've noticed that not just with my books, but with a lot of great books that have come out recently, even by major reporters, end up selling very few books. Now, I know one of the traits of a progressive or liberal mind is, oh, I know that author, and I know what that author stands for, so I don't really have to read that book. That's just redundant. I know that author represents women's rights, or I know that author is trying to get the mining industry to clean up its act, because I've read about that in the past. They just give it a wave of the hand. Some of our closest associates, coast to coast, they don't even read my column, free electronically, nader.org. So that's a bad sign. If you don't read, you're not likely to think in a way that moves you to action. So I want to say to our listeners, when we have promoted various books by authors on our program, including our materials, we have not been reassured by the level of response. So please don't think you know what's in this book, because this book is about the subject intimate to your own role, as Steve has started inquiring about, and will be continued next week with David and Hannah.
To get your copy of Civic Self Respect, go to nader.org. For $18, you'll get a signed copy, shipping included, in the United States. Next up, we're going to hear about how the Trump administration is trying to weaponize the IRS. But first, let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, April 18, 2025. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Besieged by thousands of lawsuits alleging that its paraquat weed killer causes Parkinson's disease, Syngenta has entered into an agreement aimed at settling large swaths of those claims. That's according to a report from Carrie Gillum at the New Lead. The company and lead counsel for thousands of plaintiffs have entered into a signed letter agreement intended to resolve the litigation. The move to settle comes amid mounting calls to ban paraquat, and as growing numbers of Parkinson's patients blame the company for not warning them of paraquat's risks. Numerous scientific studies have linked Parkinson's to exposure to paraquat, a weed killer commonly used in agriculture. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman, Hannah, and Ralph. Our next guest knows a thing or two about the inner workings of the Internal Revenue Service and the consequences of gutting this extremely important agency. David?
John Koskinen served as the IRS commissioner from 2013 to 2017. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, John Koskinen.
Happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Welcome indeed. Listeners, John Koskinen and I go back way, way back when he was on the Senator Ribicoff's committee. We were working in the latter stages of the auto safety drive back decades ago. And since then, John has done so many other things inside and outside of government that it would be tedious to repeat them right here. Suffice it to say that as IRS commissioner with 6 other former IRS commissioners, Republicans, Democrats, they penned an op-ed in the New York Times protesting vigorously the destruction of the IRS capacity to do its job, collect uncollected taxes, pursue major tax evasions by complex corporate and super-rich taxpayers. And we're going to discuss that once we get the review of the latest of what the Trump administration is doing with the musketeers to the Internal Revenue Service. Can you give us some quantitative assessment here and what you think is going to happen if the IRS gets chopped up like this?
Well, the IRS is getting chopped up, so it's not a question of whether. Recently, in the last couple of days, they've announced that 20,000 IRS employees have taken the buyout offer. And the reason for that, I'm confident, is they've been rattling the cage of the agency and other agencies as well, trying to get people to leave out of this drive to just get rid of people. And what they don't understand, beyond the people who already left and the 7,000 probationary employees who've gone, is that when you do something like the buyout and just willy-nilly have 20,000 employees leave, a number of those people, significant number, are managers, they're experienced people, they're people who've been around for 20 or 25 years, could have retired 30%, 35% of the agency could have retired in the last year or two on a very nice pension. So it is going to be I think, a major disaster when you get into the next filing season. This filing season was set up and has been running smoothly. And of course, Tuesday was tax day. Hope everybody filed their returns. And it went well, even with all of the background noise going on. But this is going to mean that in some ways it's really nonsensical. An administration that says they're worried about the deficit. They're trying to make sure that all of this is justified to some way we're going to save millions of dollars or hundreds of millions or billions. And if that's your goal, it makes no sense at all to hamstring your revenue collecting off. So to say, on the one hand, we're really worried about the deficit and we're worried about how to fund our tax cuts. And on the other hand, really trying to, in effect, destroy the agency that collects your revenues. The IRS collects 95 to 98% of all of the funds the government collects. It just makes no sense whatsoever.
Give us an idea of the total employment in the IRS, collect all this money, and I heard at one point that Trump and Musk wanted to cut out 45,000 employees. What's the total employment number?
They had rebuilt the IRS in 2000. The IRS had 100,000 people, and even in 2010. During my tenure from 2013 to 17, the budget got cut by over 10 or 15% every year. Well, not every year, 10% cut the total. So we lost about 20,000 employees. So the agency was down to about 80,000, even though we had 15 million more taxpayers than we had in 2010. So with the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA as it was known, the IRS was given permanent long-term funding of $80 billion over 10 years to restaff, to do modernization, to in fact bring the agency, as I say, into the 21st century. That 80 billion, 60 billion has been taken back. The budget's under constraints again. And the 20,000 just by themselves who took the buyout would reduce the agency to 80,000. But as I said, there are 7,000 probationary employees who left. So this is an agency that is headed toward having 30,000 fewer employees than they had 15 years ago. And even with improvements of technology and electronic filing, there's no way you can be efficient and do the work that needs to be done when your workforce has been cut that way. And a significant part of the cuts are in the revenue agents and revenue officers. So again, what you're doing is undermining the ability of the agency to collect taxes that are owed.
And a lot of these cuts are in areas where the IRS staff is highly specialized and skilled in going after the complex, evasive maneuvers of corporations and the super rich. I once had lunch with the head of the IRS in the late 1970s, John, and I asked him this question. I said, I've been told that fewer people understand the complexity of the insurance code part of the IRS laws than understand Einstein's theory of relativity. And he said, I wouldn't be surprised if that's the case. I said, what is the consequence of having such a complex section of the IRS code that almost nobody understands it? He said, the consequence is it's not enforced. It's not enforceable. We can't even find the skilled actuaries who are not very large in number and are snapped up by private corporations to be our investigators or expert witnesses. So this isn't just, lack of service, listeners. When you telephone the IRS and you're put on hold interminably, if you can even told that, it's that hundreds of billions of dollars are not being collected. Give us some idea of what, say, the amount of uncollected taxes in 2023 or 2022 were.
The IRS regularly for years has tried to estimate exactly how compliance is going. And so they they've got 3-year swap. They do special, just at random audits of people at all income levels just to see, without any indication that there's a problem, but just taking random 10,000, 13,000 audits a year to see where the compliance rate is and where people are not paying and what they're doing or where they're not filing at all. And that generates over 3 years an average of what the annual tax gap is. That is the amount of money that is owed that's not collected. For several years, that number was in the range of $400 to $450 billion a year, which seemed like a large number. That number now is estimated to have grown to close to $700 billion. Now, when I was the commissioner, I used to explain to people not all of that money is collectible. A lot of people have financial difficulty, have gone bankrupt, it disappeared. And the estimate then and even now is about a third of that is very wealthy individuals, and many surprising number of wealthy individuals don't file at all on the ground that they're not going to get caught. And it's small businesses or gig employees who are just not reporting or not reporting accurately. So the assumption has been that there's probably $150, $200 billion a year of collectible revenue that's being missed. And that's in time when the IRS was not substantially hampered the way they're going to be now. I mean, we were hampered when I was there. They say we lost 20,000 employees, but the tax gap stayed fairly constant. So there's a significant amount of money out there. I mean, the challenge has been in this administration is after undocumented immigrants. Undocumented immigrants pay an estimated $70 billion a year in taxes. And they do that because if they have a chance of becoming a citizen, one of the first questions they get asked is, did you pay taxes on your income? Now, some of those taxes are collected with W-2s and withholding, but in any event, it's about $70 billion. Now, they file on the promise and the premise that the IRS protects individual data and doesn't share it with anyone. So my concern with this reach into the agency by Homeland Security and others trying to get data on these immigrants is that 70 billion is going to shrink. And the estimate has been it's probably going to shrink at least by 50%. So that's 35 billion alone just in that small area. Boy, everybody measures over 10 years, that's $350 billion that you're going to lose just because of your activities.
Give us an idea of what the budget of the IRS was before Trump took office and what you think the budget should be for a functioning, productive, responsive IRS.
The budget has been relatively constant, which is unfortunate because you have pay raises and more taxpayers, and that gets more complicated. But the budget, when I was there in the range, it's been cut back to about 11 billion. I think it's now in the range of 12 or 13 billion. But just the enforcement action alone by the IRS collects over 50 or 60 billion dollars a year. So I used to say to the Congress trying to get the appropriations, the IRS is the only agency where if you give it money, it gives you more money back. Because the more you can actually audit people who aren't paying the proper amount or aren't filing at all, the better off you are. So no one has ever disagreed with that. The question is, do you get 4 times as much, 6, 8, or 10? And it depends a little on what the programs are. But even the most conservative Freedom Caucus people never disagreed with me that if you gave the IRS more money, you'd get multiples of that back. So the $80 billion that was long-term funding was significant because it allowed the IRS for the first time to do longer-term contracts. And I used to try to get Congress to understand when, as you said, Ralph, when people can't get through on the phone, they can't get an answer. Those are not just Democrats. They're not just Republicans. They're independents. They're everybody. They're everybody's constituent who are now being hampered in trying to do the right thing, which about 85% of people do, which is they're trying to become compliant. I used to say, if you're trying to become compliant, the IRS spends a lot of time trying to help you. There are deferred payment plans. There are offers in compromise. But on the other hand, if you're cheating or not filing or trying to stretch the envelope, then I'm happy to chase you to the end of the world. Okay, make sure that the people who are paying are confident that everybody is paying. And if you're not filing, they're confident the IRS will go after you.
Listeners should know that the budget that John Koskinen just estimated for the IRS is less than what one aircraft carrier costs the Pentagon or the taxpayer. Less than one aircraft carrier, which now comes in at about $14 to $16 billion for the ship. When you were IRS commissioner, John, you were very rigorous in protecting the privacy of IRS taxpayers. And now Musk has just blown that apart, and they're trying to get access to the private data of taxpayers. Is that succeeding?
Unfortunately, I think it is. What they've done is forced out, we're now on our 4th acting commissioner, our 4th commissioner, Danny Werfel was there in January. Since January, we're on our 4th commissioner because Doug Dunlap just basically tried to get access to the data and the acting commissioners have refused, and then they've been pushed or demoted or otherwise moved out of the agency. They keep looking for somebody who will actually agree. And so they have now an agreement. They've limited it under pressure from everyone to say, well, there's an exception to the privacy statute that says if there's a criminal prosecution involved, then the Department of Justice can have access to that data. Or if the IRS and the Criminal Investigation Division is chasing organized crime or syndicates or others, then if it's a criminal actual prosecution, that data can be used as part of the prosecution. But if the Justice Department is asking for it on its own, they have to get a court order. So this agreement says not only criminal prosecutions or criminals, it says those under criminal investigation. And as I've told people, we all could be said to be under criminal investigation. They don't provide any data. They don't provide any indication of what that's all about. So they're poised to now reach into the IRS database and get information on more people. And I think beyond the underfunding of the IRS and the billions of dollars that are going to be lost, in many ways, the most serious problem for the IRS is this attempt to, in effect, weaponize the IRS. You saw the president yesterday say that in his battle with Harvard, trying to take over Harvard, and to their great credit, Harvard has said, private universities shouldn't be run by the government. They have the right to decide who to admit, who to hire, and what to teach. And the president's response to that, showing where they're going, is, well, maybe Harvard ought to lose their tax exempt status. They do all these things. And so, maybe we should just take a look at that. And the idea that the president of the United States, there's a statute that says the president can't order an audit, comes out of Nixon's enemies list back in the Watergate days 60 years ago. The fact that there's a statute that says the president can't order an audit, he basically suggested that it might be very nice to have an audit of Harvard's tax exempt status. And if they start to do that, and if they keep putting people into the IRS that promoted from where they're otherwise who are beholden to them, then I think all bets are off. And I think it's a critical issue, because if taxpayers think that when they're audited, it's all a political issue, the confidence in the government, the confidence in the tax system is going to collapse.
For sure, and it looks like he's just getting started here. He shows no sign of restraint, and what they're doing is largely lawless in terms of their penetration of the IRS privacy systems, which is, of course, they're pursuing lawless initiatives throughout the government. You mentioned how critical all this was. Let's take it to the congressional level. Congress is about to consider, under the Republican control, of the tax and budget legislation, and they're going to use what's known as the reconciliation process so they can avoid a filibuster and get it through with a bare majority. Let's take the urgency, John Koskinen, to Congress. You and 6 other retired IRS commissioners are talking to the press anytime that you are asked to. You're giving a lot of interviews, but I don't see much of an impact of that, however noble it is. Most of the other retired officials of other agencies have not banded together. You all have, in a bipartisan fashion. But we're proposing unofficial congressional hearings in the House Ways and Means Committee by the Democrats and in the Senate Finance Committee by the Democrats. They're in the minority. They can't have official hearings, but they can take a committee room, have an unofficial hearing, as Elizabeth Warren did a few weeks ago on the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's dissolution, and she got press. You can have good witnesses. You've indicated that you and probably your other retired IRS commissioners would be quite responsive to an invitation to go to Capitol Hill and testify with your experience and authority. There's very likelihood that the major media will give you coverage. Not much going on in a sensible way on Capitol Hill to occupy them. And the only way I see this happening is have some more focused lobbying, because already the Democrats are beginning to like this idea of unofficial hearings committee by committee, and I see a stirring there. You see a possibility of all of you retired commissioners rustling together some money to hire a couple lobbyists full-time, one on the House and the Senate, because being present there daily and networking, as you know, because of your experience on Capitol Hill, is an extension of speaking out that's irreplaceable. Can you talk about the need to have a citizen lobbyist there, which your prestige and experience can get together rather quickly?
Well, I think it's an important idea because, as you say, it's not clear that people are paying enough attention to this, although an increase in press calls I've gotten means that people are beginning to sense that beyond disarming the IRS by cutting its budget and lowering the employment by anywhere from 25 to 45%, that this issue of weaponizing the IRS threatens everybody. And it is something that people ought to be paying attention to. And so I do think that it's important for the Congress to be paying attention. Of course, as you said, the Democrats are in the minority and thus far have not figured out much of a way to actually influence the final votes on issues as they come through. In many ways, when you think about it in terms of the role the Constitution sets up for the various elements of government, our protection really comes down to the courts. People are spending their time and money actually formally, directly challenging actions of this administration that are beyond the pale, are unconstitutional, or violate statutes. And there are well over 100 lawsuits. And the challenge is going to be when the administration is losing those lawsuits as they are, they then appeal and they're relying on hoping that the Supreme Court will support the president in some unified executive autocratic theory of the Constitution. But that, I think, is the most important way to go, Dan, because that is a way that has, as you can see, we'll see what happens with this issue of the poor guy who was mistakenly sent to El Salvador. And the administration appears not to be following the Supreme Court's order that they do whatever they can to facilitate his return. And the response of the administration is to do nothing. So I think as we move into what I've, as you know, Ralph and I have known each other for almost 60 years. I've been through a lot of crises. I've spent my career managing turnarounds of government or private sector companies. And it's not my mode of operation to be excitable. But I do think the actions being taken across the board here create the greatest threat to this country since the Civil War. The basic fundamental rules of democracy are being challenged by this administration. And I think ultimately the only defense is going to be in the courts.
Well, going back to Capitol Hill, I think the problem the Democrats have had is the Republicans have exploited the public stereotyping of the IRS. The IRS is not exactly a popular agency among the American people. And they have exploited that, and they've used and exaggerated a few bad examples of IRS mistreatment to mobilize what they think is a popular base for what they're doing. What the Democrats should be doing is saying, you cut back the IRS, and the rich and the corporate are going to benefit, and you, the taxpayers, are going to pay the price along with your children and grandchildren, because you're either going to get less service or you're going to get greater deficits. One way or another, the Democrats have failed to identify a healthy and well-equipped IRS with the interests of average taxpayers. And the evidence of that is I haven't located one leader or follower in the Democratic Party accusing the Republicans of actively abating and assisting large-scale tax evasion by the way they're cutting into the IRS. And that would be a good political issue, it seemed to me, because over 85% of the American people want higher taxes on the undertaxed super-rich and the corporations. That's a lot of conservative voters, along with liberal voters. I'm still waiting for a Senate or House floor speech by a Democrat defending the IRS. Do we think that's a real problem here?
Well, going back thousands of years, tax collectors have never been particularly popular. And so when you talk about the IRS, people say, oh, the poor old IRS. In some ways, they don't understand just the point you're making about the impact on them, on the country, of an ineffective IRS going forward. And that's why my thought is this move toward using the IRS to attack people ought to be a way for everyone to say, I may not love paying taxes, but I certainly don't want the government and the president or the Treasury Secretary or somebody else ordering an audit of my taxes just because they don't like my political position or what I'm teaching in my course. And that goes beyond the idea that, I'd rather not pay as much tax as I do. So my sense is that's the thing that people can understand and grasp. The issue that is clearly going to happen, we have a $35 trillion debt, and part of what you see is concerns what was going on with the bond market is at some point, people in the world who hold our debt are going to worry about whether we're good for it. And if we keep running deficits showing no ability to come close to looking like we're financially responsible, at some point that's going to come back to haunt us. And if we ever end up losing our position as the dominant economy in the world, we're likely to be treated like Greece. That is, you guys are way in debt. We're not buying your bonds unless you do all sorts of draconian actions to try to get your budget under control. But most people, it's a complicated position, and most people don't focus on that. But if you tell people you're likely to be the target of an audit because somebody in the administration doesn't like you, you would think that would get people's attention.
Well, I know we're getting some listeners thinking now that we're not talking about all the porous escape hatches in a tax code that Jimmy Carter once called a disgrace to the human race. That's not what we're focusing on right now, listeners. We've done that in prior programs where we've had representatives, tax reformers, and the Patriotic Millionaires Group. There's 20 staff on K Street in Washington and is fighting the good fight, John, but it doesn't get much coverage. Patriotic Millionaires, go to their website. You'll see what they're trying to do, counteract what's going on by the Republican domination of the Congress and the occupant. Well, we've run out of time. We've been speaking with John Koskinen, former IRS commissioner during the Obama administration, who, together with 6 other retired IRS commissioners, Republicans and Democrats, penned an op-ed in the New York Times warning our country of the convulsions that result from slashing the staff and budget an already restricted Internal Revenue Service under our Treasury Department. Thank you very much, John Koskinen, for your work in the past as well as your present.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
That's our show. To get your copy of Civic Self Respect, go to nader.org. For $18, you get a signed copy, shipping included in the United States. And I want to thank our guests again, Ralph Nader and John Koskinen. For those of you listening on the radio, we're going to cut out now. But for you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with, in case you haven't heard, a transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Anna Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you. And a sobering fact in Harper's Magazine about the worsening Palestinian Holocaust, Harper reports the percentage of children in Gaza who said that they wanted to die, 49%. Percent of children in Gaza who believed they would soon die, 96%. With U.S. weapons and U.S. co-belligerency all the way.
Oh, you should step up. I think